There are moments when the world seems to lean closer to us, as though it has something urgent to whisper. Not a shout, not a spectacle, but a quiet insistence that refuses to be ignored. You may have felt it already, a restlessness that is not born of fear, a concern that does not come from your own troubles. It arrives unannounced, settles in your chest, and will not explain itself. You wonder why a particular thought keeps returning, why a certain face, perhaps one you barely know or one you thought you had forgotten, keeps appearing at the edge of your prayers. We are often taught to distrust such moments, to call them imagination or sentiment. Yet history, both sacred and ordinary, is filled with people who learn too late that these nudges were not accidents at all. It is tempting to believe that divine requests, if they exist, must come with thunder or unmistakable signs. We imagine burning bushes and voices from the sky, and because our lives do not resemble such scenes, we assume we are not being addressed. But this assumption rests on a misunderstanding of how God usually speaks. He does not compete with noise, he waits for quiet. He does not force himself upon the will, he invites it. And often his invitation comes disguised as responsibility toward another human being. When help is required urgently, it rarely announces itself as holy. It looks instead like inconvenience, interruption, or risk. Consider how easy it is to overlook one person's need when the world offers so many. We scroll past suffering because it is endless, and we grow numb as a form of self-defense. Yet every so often one need breaks through this fog. One woman's pain, confusion, or danger becomes uncomfortably clear to you. You do not know all the details, but you know enough to feel uneasy doing nothing. At that point, neutrality becomes a choice, and not a harmless one. The hardest truth to accept is that in such moments, inaction is not the absence of decision, it is the decision itself. We prefer to imagine ourselves as kind in theory, courageous in principle, generous under ideal conditions. But the call before you now is not theoretical. It does not ask what you believe about goodness. It asks what you will do with your hands, your words, your time. You may protest that you are unqualified, that you do not have the resources, that someone else would surely be better suited. These objections sound humble, but they often mask a deeper fear, that if you act, you will be changed by the act itself. To help another is never a neutral transaction. It binds you even briefly to their story. There is also the unsettling possibility that this moment is not primarily about her, but about you, not in a selfish sense, but in the sense that character is forged only where choice is real. Comfort does not reveal who we are, pressure does. If God wished merely to solve a problem, he could do so without involving fragile human beings. Yet again and again, he chooses to work through willing hands, perhaps because love that is forced ceases to be love at all. What is asked of you now is not perfection, only obedience, an openness to be used where you stand. You may wonder what will happen if you step forward. The honest answer is that there are no guarantees of visible success. Help does not always look heroic, and outcomes do not always reward effort. Sometimes the only thing accomplished is that someone does not feel alone at the worst hour of their life. But this too matters more than we like to admit. The world is not redeemed in grand gestures alone, but in small acts of faithfulness that never make headlines. Right now, urgency presses against hesitation. This is not a call to deliberation or careful delay. It is a call to act while the moment is still alive, before fear hardens into excuse. You are not being asked to save the world, only to answer for the portion of it that has been placed unmistakably within your reach. There is a strange comfort in believing that responsibility belongs to someone else. It allows us to observe the world from a safe distance, to feel sympathy without involvement, and concern without cost. Yet every so often, that comfort is disturbed. A situation presents itself that feels unavoidably personal, as though it has crossed an invisible line and entered your inner life. You did not seek it, you did not plan for it, and yet it stands before you with a quiet insistence that refuses to go away. This is usually the moment when the soul is being tested, not by great suffering of its own, but by the suffering of another that now asks for a response. it is important to understand that feeling called does not mean feeling confident. In fact, the opposite is often true. The sense that you are being asked to help frequently arrives hand in hand with doubt. You question your ability, your timing, your understanding. You tell yourself you might make things worse, that your help may be inadequate, that you lack the wisdom required for such a task. These thoughts are not signs that the call is false, they are signs that it is real. If the request were within the limits of your comfort, it would not stretch you and therefore would not change you. We often imagine that God's requests will align neatly with our strengths, but experience suggests otherwise. He seems far more interested in shaping the heart than in displaying competence. When help is required urgently, it rarely waits for perfect conditions. It comes when you are tired, busy, uncertain, and already carrying your own burdens. The temptation is to postpone obedience until you feel ready, but readiness, in the moral sense, is not a feeling. It is a decision, made despite the absence of reassurance. There is also the fear of misinterpretation. You wonder if this concern is truly placed in you for a reason, or if it is merely coincidence or emotion. Yet there is a difference between passing sympathy and persistent conviction. Passing sympathy fades as quickly as it appears. Conviction lingers. It returns when you try to dismiss it. It grows heavier when ignored. It does not accuse, but it does not release you either. Such persistence should not be treated lightly, for it often marks the boundary between awareness and responsibility. Helping another person, especially when time is short, requires more than kindness. It requires humility. You must accept that you cannot control outcomes, that your role may be small, and that your effort may not be acknowledged. This runs against the grain of human pride, which prefers clear results and visible gratitude. Yet the deepest good is often done quietly, in ways that only later reveal their signify. Tense. To act without assurance of success is one of the purest forms of faith, because it rests not on reward, but on obedience. You may also fear the cost. To step in is to risk emotional involvement, misunderstanding, or rejection. It may disrupt your plans and expose your vulnerabilities. Doing nothing feels safer because it preserves the illusion of peace. But peace purchased at the price of conscience is fragile. It cracks easily and leaves behind a deeper unease than the one it was meant to avoid. There are few burdens heavier than the knowledge that you could have acted and chose not to. It is worth remembering that help does not always mean solutions. Sometimes it means presence. Sometimes it means speaking when silence would be easier, or listening when advice would feel more impressive. The value of your action lies not in its scale but in its sincerity. One honest act, done at the right moment, can shift the direction of a life in ways that no grand plan ever could. Wedge. What stands before you now is not a demand for heroism, but an invitation to faithfulness. You are not being asked to carry the weight of the entire outcome, only to carry your part of the responsibility. The rest does not belong to you. If you wait for absolute clarity, you may wait until the moment has passed. If you wait for certainty, you may miss the opportunity that was meant to refine you. The truth is simple and unsettling. When a need is placed before you with urgency and you are able to respond, your response becomes part of your moral story. It shapes who you are becoming. To act is to allow yourself to be changed. To refuse is also to be changed, though in a quieter, harder way. The question is not whether this moment matters, but what kind of person you will be after it passes. There is a quiet danger in assuming that urgency always announces itself loudly. We are trained to respond to alarms, deadlines, and visible crises, yet the most important moments often arrive with drama. They come softly, wrapped in ordinary circumstances, and ask for discernment rather than reaction. You may feel no rush of adrenaline, no dramatic surge of emotion, only a steady awareness that something requires attention now, not later. This is precisely why such moments are easy to ignore. They do not force themselves upon you, they wait to see whether you will notice. We like to believe that goodness is instinctive, that when the time comes we will naturally do the right thing. But instinct alone is unreliable, because it bends easily under comfort, fear, and habit. What is required instead is attentiveness, To notice another's need in time to act is already a kind of grace. It means you are being trusted with knowledge that not everyone has been given, and knowledge, once received, carries weight. It alters what you can claim not to know, and therefore what you can excuse. There is a particular discomfort that arises when you realize you are in a position to help, and your help cannot be replaced easily. If someone else could do it just as well, the pressure would lessen. But when circumstances narrow and options disappear, responsibility sharpens. You may try to reason your way out of it, telling yourself that involvement is optional, that boundaries must be protected, that self-preservation is wisdom. These arguments are not without merit, yet they become suspect when they are used to silence conscience rather than to guide action. One of the great illusions of modern life is the belief that moral responsibility should never interrupt personal order. We want to do good so long as it fits neatly into our schedules and does not demand too much of us. But real need is rarely polite. It does not wait for convenience. It breaks in, rearranges priorities, and exposes how carefully we have organized our lives to avoid inconvenience. When help is needed now, it asks whether our values are strong enough to endure disruption. There is also the fear of being mistaken. You worry that you may have misunderstood the situation, that your involvement could be unwelcome or misinterpreted. This fear can paralyze, especially when the cost of error feels high. Yet refusing to act because certainty is unavailable is itself a gamble. It bets that doing nothing will have fewer consequences than doing something imperfectly. History and experience suggest otherwise. Regret tends to follow missed opportunities more faithfully than failed attempts. Another layer of hesitation comes from the desire to remain uninvolved emotionally. To help is to open yourself to another person's pain, confusion, or fear. It means you may carry their story longer than you expect. Detachment feels safer because it promises distance. But distance also dulls compassion over time. If practiced too often, it becomes a habit rather than a choice, and the heart slowly forgets how to respond at all. There are losses more serious than exhaustion, and one of them is indifference. It is worth noting that urgency does not mean recklessness. Acting now does not require abandoning wisdom or discernment. It requires movement rather than paralysis. A small step taken promptly is often more valuable than a perfect plan delayed indefinitely. You are not being asked to resolve every uncertainty, only to refuse the comfort of delay when delay serves no one. Faithfulness is not measured by how much you accomplish, but by whether you respond when the moment still matters. There is something deeply humbling about realizing that timing itself can be a moral factor. An action that would mean little tomorrow may mean everything today. A word spoken too late may comfort no one. A gesture withheld may close a door that will not reopen. This is why urgency presses so firmly on the conscience. It reminds you that life does not pause while you weigh every possibility. It moves forward, carrying consequences with it. To act now is to accept that you are part of a larger story, unfolding in real time. You do not see the whole picture, and you are not asked to. You are asked only to be present where you are, attentive to what has been placed before you, and willing to respond while response is still possible. In such moments, action becomes less about heroism and more about honesty, the honest admission that you see the need, and the honest refusal to turn away. There is a subtle but profound difference between being willing to help and being ready to help when it costs you something real. Many people sincerely believe they are generous, compassionate, and obedient in spirit, yet these qualities often remain untested because the situations that demand sacrifice are quietly avoided. When a moment arrives that threatens comfort, reputation, or emotional safety, the heart reveals what it truly values. It is here, in this narrow space between intention and action, that faith stops being an idea and becomes a lived reality. One of the hardest lessons to accept is goodness rarely feels noble while it is being practiced. In the imagination, helping others appears clean and affirming, but in life it is often awkward, tiring, and confusing. You may not know the right words to say. You may worry that your presence will be misunderstood or that your efforts will fall short. Yet moral growth does not depend on elegance, it depends on willingness. A clumsy act of care, offered sincerely, carries more weight than flawless indifference. There is also the quiet fear of exposure. To step forward is to be seen, and to be seen is to risk judgment. Others may question your motives, your boundaries, or your wisdom. You may even question yourself, but hiding behind invisibility has its own cost. When you consistently choose safety over truth, you slowly shrink your own capacity for courage. The soul was not designed to remain untouched. It was designed to be shaped by love, and love, by its nature, leaves marks. Another obstacle lies in the desire for FI. You may feel that you have already given enough, suffered enough, endured enough. You may ask why this responsibility should fall on you and not on someone else who seems more capable or less burdened. These questions are understandable, yet they rarely lead to peace. Life does not distribute responsibility according to what feels fair, but according to what is possible in a given moment. If something has been placed within your reach, it is because, for reasons you may not yet see, you are able to reach it. It is also tempting to reduce help to solutions. We want problems to end neatly so that our involvement can end with them, but people are not puzzles, and pain does not resolve on command. Sometimes the most meaningful form of help is endurance, the decision to remain present even when progress is slow or invisible. This kind of faithfulness is exhausting precisely because it offers no immediate reward. It asks you to value the person more than the outcome, and obedience more than success. You may discover that acting in this way unsettles your carefully maintained sense of control. Helping another often exposes how little control you truly have, not only over circumstances, but over your own emotions. You may feel frustration, sorrow, or helplessness, that you cannot fix everything. Yet this discomfort can be instructive. It reminds you that you are not meant to be the source of salvation, only a participant in mercy. There is freedom in accepting limits without using them as excuses. Another truth emerges when you choose to act. You are changed by the act itself, not always immediately and not always pleasantly, but inevitably. Compassion exercised under pressure deepens the heart. It makes future indifference harder and future courage more natural. Each time you respond faithfully, you train your conscience to recognize what matters most. Each time you refuse, you teach it to be quieter. Over time, this training shapes the kind of person you become. Without asking your permission, there is also a mysterious reciprocity at work. When you help another in their vulnerability, you often encounter your own. Their need reflects parts of yourself you would rather ignore. This can be uncomfortable, but it is not accidental. We are often invited to give in the very areas where we ourselves need growth. In lifting another, you may find that something in you is also being lifted, though not always in the way you expect. What is asked of you now is not certainty, nor flawless execution, nor emotional strength. What is asked is honesty, honesty about what you see, honesty about what you can do, and honesty about the cost of doing nothing. Action taken in good faith, even when imperfect, aligns you with truth, and truth, once chosen, has a way of sustaining those who choose it, even when the path remains difficult and unclear. There is a moment, often overlooked, when hesitation turns into habit. At first, delay feels reasonable, even wise. Why? Tell yourself you are gathering information, protecting balance, waiting for a clearer sign. But over time, waiting can become a refuge, a place where responsibility slowly dissolves into abstraction. What was once a specific call becomes a general intention to be kind someday, when circumstances are easier. The danger is not that you stop believing in goodness, but that goodness becomes theoretical, safely detached from action. One reason this happens is that we misunderstand the nature of trust. We assume trust requires certainty, yet certainty is rarely available where faith is required. Trust, in its truest sense, is choosing to move forward without guarantees. It is the decision to act on what you know now, rather than on what you wish you could know later. When a need presents itself clearly enough to disturb your peace, it is often already clear enough to demand response. Additional clarity is sometimes less about guidance and more about avoidance. There is also the quiet 8% of self-concern. You may worry about how involvement will affect your own stability, your emotional health, or your future. These are not trivial concerns, and ignoring them entirely would be unwise. Yet they must be held in proportion. When self-protection becomes the highest value, compassion is reduced to a luxury rather than a duty. Life then becomes an exercise in preservation rather than purpose. The soul, however, was not designed merely to survive, but to participate in love, even when love asks for courage. Another challenge lies in the fear of responsibility once action is taken. To help once may create expectation to help again. To speak up may require continued honesty. This sense of ongoing obligation can feel overwhelming, as though saying yes now means surrendering control forever. But responsibility does not work that way. You are accountable only for what is given to you in each moment. Tomorrow's burdens do not belong to you today. Faithfulness practiced one Saint EP at a time prevents the future from becoming an excuse to avoid the present. It is also worth examining the subtle pride that sometimes hides behind reluctance. We may believe that unless we can offer something impressive, our contribution is not worth making. This belief flatters the ego while excusing inaction. In reality, help is rarely measured by its brilliance. It is measured by its presence. A simple act done at the right time can outweigh grand gestures performed too late. What matters is not how significant your action appears, but whether it meets the need that stands before you. There is a deep humility required to accept that you may never see the full impact of what you do. Outcomes may remain hidden. Gratitude may never be expressed. The person you help may move on, and the story may continue without you. This can feel unsatisfying, especially in a world that rewards visibility and recognition. Yet unseen faithfulness has always been the quiet engine of real change. Much of what sustains humanity is done by people whose names are forgotten, whose efforts leave no public record, but whose obedience altered lives all the same. Acting in such moments also reshapes your relationship with fear. Fear does not disappear when you confront it, it loses its authority. Each time you choose to act, despite discomfort, fear becomes a signal rather than a master. It tells you that something meaningful is at stake, not that you must retreat. Over time, this changes how you understand courage. Courage is no longer the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide what kind of person you will be. There is also a quiet alignment that occurs when action and conviction meet. Inner conflict eases, not because the situation is resolved, but because you are no longer divided within yourself. The strain of knowing what ought to be done while avoiding it is heavier than the strain of doing it imperfectly. Peace, in this sense, is not the reward for success, but the byproduct of integrity. It comes from living in agreement with what you believe to be true. In the end, the question placed before you is not whether you can guarantee a good result, but whether you are willing to be faithful with what has been entrusted to you. The moment will not wait indefinitely. It will pass, carrying its consequences quietly with it. What remains is the shape it leaves in you, formed by the choice you make when action was possible and silence was easier. There comes a point when reflection must give way to decision, not because every question has been answered, but because the moment itself demands honesty. You may feel that you have thought enough, prayed enough, considered every angle, and still the uncertainty remains. This is not a failure of discernment, it is a feature of moral life. Some choices are not meant to be made with full visibility, they are meant to be made with trust, rooted in what you know of goodness rather than in what you can predict of outcomes. At this stage, the temptation is to retreat inward, to make the struggle entirely pari. Wait. You tell yourself that intention matters more than action, that goodwill counts even if nothing is done, yet intention left unexpressed slowly loses its substance. It becomes a sentiment rather than a force. The world is not changed by what we mean to do, but by what we are willing to do while uncertainty still surrounds us. To act is to allow belief to take on weight, to step out of the realm of thought and into the realm of responsibility. There is also the realization that delay has its own consequences. Time is not neutral. It either serves the good or erodes it. When help is postponed, circumstances shift, Opportunities close and trust weakens. What could have been eased becomes heavier. What could have been shared becomes isolated. Even when no visible harm occurs, something within you hardens slightly, learning that hesitation is an acceptable response to need. This internal change is subtle, but it accumulates, shaping future decisions in ways you may not notice until much later. You may still wrestle with the fear that your action will be insufficient. This fear often disguises a desire to control the narrative, to ensure that your involvement produces a clear and satisfying resolution. But life rarely grants such neat conclusions. Meaningful action is often fragmentary. You enter another person's story briefly, offer what you can, and then step back without knowing how the story continues. This lack of closure can feel unsatisfying, yet it reflects a deeper truth: you are not the author, only a participant. Another layer of resistance arises from the cost to identity. Helping in this way may require you to see yourself differently, not as an observer, but as someone whose choices carry weight. This can be unsettling. It removes the comfort of detachment and replaces it with accountability. Yet this shift is also an invitation into maturity. To accept that your actions matter is to accept that your life has moral significance beyond personal comfort. It is a heavy realization, but also a dignifying one. You may notice that once you decide to act, however tentatively, something changes internally. The anxiety that accompanied indecision does not vanish, but it reorganizes. It becomes energy rather than paralysis. Fear no longer circles endlessly, it moves alongside you, no longer in front of you. This does not mean the path becomes easy. It means it becomes honest. You are no longer pretending that avoidance is neutrality or that silence is wisdom. It is important to remember that acting does not require abandoning compassion for yourself. Sacrifice is not the same as self-erasure. You are allowed to recognize your limits, to ask for help, to acknowledge exhaustion. But these acknowledgements are meant to inform action, not replace it. They keep obedience grounded rather than reckless. They remind you that humility includes knowing what you cannot do, as well as what you must do. As you move forward, you may discover that the significance of this moment extends beyond the immediate situation. It becomes a reference point, a memory your conscience will return to in future decisions, not because everything went well, but because you chose alignment over avoidance. Such moments quietly recalibrate the soul. They make future courage slightly less costly and future compassion slightly more natural. What lies before you now is not a dramatic turning point visible to others, but an interior crossing that defines direction. Once crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. You will know that when need appeared clearly and urgently, you did not look away. That knowledge settles somewhere deep, shaping how you listen, how you respond, and how seriously you take the quiet movements of responsibility when they rise again, asking not for perfection, but for presence and willingness in the moment that has been given.